As with most endlessly fascinating artists, Martha Diamond is an elusive painter of contradictions. Abstract, yet profoundly realist, but compellingly abstract. Her paintings highly gestural, yet methodically planned and executed. Urban, yet ancient. Wide open, but also deeply internal, personal. Hers is a singular achievement in the painting of urban experience, an achievement which simultaneously extends the traditions of both American visionary painting and gestural abstraction in a totally unique way. Known, but still frustratingly lacking in wider recognition, she was included in the 1989 Whitney Biennial and would often pop up in larger surveys of city painting across the decades. Shows and publications where the originality of the work would stand out by a country mile. Though she exhibited regularly, often appearing in group exhibitions curated by painters, bigger and better put together solo shows only ramped up in the last few years of her life. Misplaced by history, Deep Time is her first museum survey, the first substantial look at her career in its entirety. Having already travelled from Colby College, painting nerds caught the show at the Aldrich Contemporary Art Museum, a fitting venue given its history. Significantly, museum founder Larry Aldrich made her first institutional purchases in the early 1970s, also picking up the exploratory Joan Mitchell-esque Untitled of 1973 for his personal collection, a work placed symbolically at the show's entrance. In 1971, the Aldrich staged 26 contemporary women artists, a historically important survey of emerging artists who had yet to have a solo show in New York City. Curated by Lucy R. Lippard at the invitation of the Aldrich's then director, Dorothy Mayhall, it featured many of Diamond's contemporaries, as well as a post-minimal vocabulary of mounds, modular structures and loosened grids, all devices which would be dynamically recast across her career. Her still formative practice fully plugged into the culture, just as it would synthesize ideas from a wide range of art forms and sources down the years. Something curators Levi Prombaum and Amy Smith-Stewart touch on in the relatively brief but much needed career-spanning catalogue essay, hopefully spurring further study in future. The multiplication of readings and residencies around Diamond's paintings an essential task in the coming years. Deep Time itself is actually highly specific in the angle it takes on the work. Despite its primary purpose as a general survey, it's really the first exhibition to truly push out from the city and embrace larger themes of time and nature in the paintings, themes which were only enhanced by the setting. Driving from New York to find the city reflected in the Connecticut snow felt strangely appropriate. Insulated by trees and sculpture gardens, the hyper-urban forms could not only play themselves out at full volume, but also perhaps more easily transform, unfurl. Green Cityscape, a 1985 painting in exit sign green, feels like something seen through a Manhattan window. The shifting perspectives implying the up-down parallax of an elevator ride. But the rungs of metalwork can suddenly become like palm fronds, softening up the more we let the brushwork take over. The picture has the grandeur of a pine forest shaken by the breeze, but it could equally be a model building stuck behind a display cabinet or sitting on a bookshelf. The stepped building on the left, like one of Philip Guston's monolithic tomes. The tadpole windows like open mouths in a choir or holes in a cheese grater. The entire thing taking place in the corner of an apartment kitchen. All of these seemingly random associations are actually entirely consistent with wider tensions across the work. Tensions between exterior and interior states of being, the natural and the built, the ecstatic and the abrasive. In some ways, easy to get, easy to explain, Diamond is also inexhaustible. And, far as we can try, often compellingly inexplicable. Born in 1944, Diamond grew up in an 11th floor apartment in the then brand new residential development of Stuyvesant Town, a neighbourhood both weirdly austere and cosily secluded. When the family later moved to Queens, she would accompany her doctor father on his Saturday morning rounds in the city. A highly formative memory was crossing the Queensborough Bridge to Manhattan, the buildings coming up from the horizon to envelop her. It's hard not to see the impact of those early years on the work. The soaring bridges, the approaching canyons of Midtown Manhattan, but equally the city in miniature of Stuytown and Peter Cooper Village. The apartment blocks sculptural and repetitive. Basic shapes that transform under the changing light. This 1989 painting may be of John Street in the heart of the financial district, for example, but it also seems deeply informed by the play of sunlight around her childhood kingdom of towers and courtyards. Flat faces of hyphens and dashes, early bedtime shadows. Returning from a period spent in Paris between 1964 and 65, she would eventually settle just a few blocks away at 268 Bowery, the reassuring sight of the Empire State Building still poking out from the street. It would remain her home and studio from 1969 until her death in 2023. On her return to the US with fellow Carleton College graduates Donna Dennis and Peter Sheldhall, Diamond found herself in a dynamic social milieu. Sandwiched between the initial wave of New York school poets like Frank O'Hara and John Ashbery, and the younger writers associated with the nearby poetry project at St. Mark's, people like Joe Brainard, Anne Waldman, Ted Berrigan, Bill Berkson. It was a loose literary continuity bridging two eras, just as those writers bridged relationships between the older abstract expressionist painters and the younger, poppier crowd. As Yasmin Sharma put it in Spatial Poetics, second-generation New York school poetry, these writers made it possible to be conversational, funny, urban, personal, quotidian, elusive, allusive, sincere, cosmopolitan, confessional, lyrical, and performative, often within the space of a single poem. Something we could equally say of Diamond within the space of a single canvas. Plugged into the energy of the city around her, as well as a sprawling continuity of American culture, Diamond is a wholly original urban poet herself. Entirely distinctive in her approach to a subject matter that can seem to advance or retreat depending on how you come at it, we should always remember to look far and wide at her paintings, never dismissing whatever ideas they might stir to the surface, never underestimating the amount of resonance they are both freighted with and very much open toward. To more clearly get a handle on what we're looking at when we look at Diamond's paintings, it's perhaps helpful to consider what we don't see. We never find her painting endless vistas, never straightforwardly plunging perspectives, neither craning our necks up to the tops of buildings from the ground or looking down into the tangle of streets below. Skylines are forbidden, same with traffic. These are shapes and perspectives far too rigidly tied to a certain set of meanings and a certain point in time. Diamond looks for older, more primordial encounters with form. She often hovers at a midpoint where 2 or 3 buildings and their shadows and reflections interact. Moments when the specifics of architecture either melt away or merge, or when buildings are at their most monolithic or animistic, their most formally and psychologically charged. Her small studies on board reveal an almost prehistoric sensibility at work, recalling everything from mud huts to fossils. In one of the Deep Time catalogue's best nuggets of information, we find out that her favourite book was Bernard Radowski's Architecture Without Architects, a publication based on his 1964 MoMA exhibition of the same name, a highly polemical survey of ancient, vernacular and indigenous architecture, essentially anonymous architecture. The textless exhibition allowed visitors to follow continuities of form and function across continents and centuries, subversively arguing for a more humanist approach to designing buildings, as well as a history of architecture that wasn't just a list of individual geniuses and their patrons. For Diamond's purposes, however, it seems to have been an aesthetic treasure trove. Flipping through the book is initially like finding a decryption code for the paintings, though the feeling soon fades as we catch on to the complex intermorphology at work in both projects. Importantly, there is never a one-to-one relationship between any particular photographs and paintings. Common forms emerge again and again. As she said in a PBS interview for the '89 Whitney Biennial, she was primarily interested in using shapes that have been significant to people for thousands of years, a key notion in Deep Time's reading of the work. Though, again, it would be a mistake to get too prescriptive about what the historical significance of these shapes might have actually been. Glancing between Radowski's book and Diamond's paintings, echoes and equivalences leap out, only to fade away on closer inspection, just as jolts of recognition flash past when comparing her pictures with the outside world, only to evaporate moments later. The paintings are always highly self-specific, without ever quite referring to specific things. All the same, it's clear the book was something of an inexhaustible well from which she could always draw, even if only subconsciously. A guidebook to finding a much more ancient world in the one around her. Part of the work's openness and malleability is also due to a pointed avoidance of landmarks and famous buildings. Unlike with, say, the garishly late Utrillo-esque cityscapes by the artist known as Taboo, if landmarks do rear their heads, they are usually closer to Matisse's 1914 Notre Dame. A building reduced to a basic form. The ghost of a famous building. For example, a set of triangles and circles that can evoke everything from the Chrysler Building to clusters of traffic lights hung around fire escapes. These set and trap paintings, pyramids of spheres stacked like pool balls or like Chardin's apples and cherries, are in many ways outliers in her wider oeuvre. Yet in a sense, it's also building at its purest, most rudimentary. Their reduced forms, pictorial units, which also bring out the latent still life aspects of the city paintings. the feeling that we might be looking at small models or approximations, or even objects that only happen to look like buildings. 1989's white glass like a beehive or a storage box, a bedside cabinet. Speaking of peripatetic city living, packing crates, office cubicles. Other pictures reach all the way back to childhood playthings. Under heaven detail, like a glow-in-the-dark toy under a blanket. John Street, a cardboard box against wood chip wallpaper, or a school project lined up on the judging table. But the shapes also have an abstract life of their own. These same ball and triangle motifs can recall the radically sparse abstracts of Kimber Smith, for example. An artist she's in some ways closer to than anyone we tend to associate with paintings of the urban environment. Especially at the small study and panel level, where her abstraction really runs wild. Though we could also say that Diamond brings out the latent cityscapes in Smith abstracts, the water tower and cathedral qualities of his triangles, suns, and cloudy squiggles. Equally, we might think of her in purely abstract terms, somewhat closer to Bernard Pifaretti, an artist she was shown with in the early 90s, both painters exploring long portrait formats, relationships between dominant and subdominant columns of colour, and ideas of doubling and mirroring. Though, of course, working from very different conceptual standpoints and to very different ends. Different relationships with painting and the world around them. Still, it's worth noting that Diamond's compositions are also more planned and rehearsed than we may at first realise. With crucial moments of brushwork and particularly tricky colour transitions worked out on smaller supports in advance of the full-sized painting. Despite using her non-dominant left hand precisely for its unpredictability, the work is the result of an athletic mental and physical process, a little like that of her friend Alex Katz. The final pictures, gestural abstracts executed through rigorous planning and preparation. In 1992, Diamond was insightfully shown along with Pifaretti in a group painting show at the Robert Miller Gallery, a presentation that also included Louise Fishman, Mary Heilman, and Harriet Corman, an emphatically abstract lineup. Apart from Pifaretti, each of these painters would feature in Karma's well-received 2022 survey, Painting in New York, 1971-83. And again, it was with the abstract artists that she shared the most affinities, particularly with Fishman, who, like Diamond, arrived in New York in 1965 and whose commitment to her own highly personal interpretation of abstract expressionism and idiosyncratic exploration of gesture is never boxed in by any programmatic ideas of scale or freedom from illusion and allusion. Especially in the work's evocation of the built environment, which is always just on the verge of coming into coherence. Diamond's formal language is certainly loose and limber enough that we can see associations with an extremely wide range of art, including sculptural and even installation-based practices. Her closest contemporary was the innovative sculpture and installation artist Donna Dennis, along with the critic Peter Shadehall, a fellow Carleton College graduate and lifelong friend. Their shared interest in the twilight poetry of urban structures and vernacular architecture speaks for itself, as does her penchant for finding the ancient in the modern, the temple in the ticket booth. Dennis started out painting before the work turned three-dimensional, quickly evolving from relief to full-blown sculpture. But the early pieces also find striking echoes in Diamond's later painting, suggesting a world of form and feeling looked at from opposite ends and on opposite trajectories. Diamond going down the avenue of abstraction, while Dennis's sculptures and installations would delight in becoming ever more materially literalist. Both of them, it goes without saying, preoccupied with buildings as containers of memory and conduits for metaphor. The Deep Time catalogue also makes a shrewd comparison with Jackie Winsor, an artist equally fascinated by the cross-cultural manifestations of form in architecture. And while criticism can often tie itself in knots trying to evaluate the connections between sculpture and painting, it's a comparison worth making, if only to illustrate the breadth and autonomy of form at play in Diamond's oeuvre. Like Winsor, she explores the energy and effect of things like blankness and density, vertical and horizontal extension, implied holes, globes, and lattices as expressive ends in themselves, before we even get to questions of buildings and city living. Early on, she was also shown alongside Harmony Hammond in Thick Paint, a slightly highfalutin group show curated by Carter Ratcliffe in 1978. In hindsight, not the most representative moment in either artist's career, yet their formal vocabularies would evolve into certain areas of crossover. Hammond's wrapped sculptures and softened ladders, recalling the tactile, malleable sense of form in everything from the knotted barrel monkey shapes of 1990s Span to the tightly packed rungs of Center City, the throbbing cabling of Palisades. On the subject of rungs, we might even think of the influential series of monochromatic stripe paintings by David Reed, presented at Susan Caldwell in 1975. A series of procedural works relating to notions of gesture, time and scale, body and reach, which aren't totally alien to Diamond's purposes, despite appearances. Particularly when we consider more ascetic works like White Glass or Token from the same year. Or this unique series of paintings from 2008, which find her at her most reduced, though still highly evocative. The jagged stripes, suggestive of anything from barbed wire to regulated heartbeats. Once again internalising ideas from post-minimal abstraction and pulling them back into a world of image and illusion. A quick walk around the Whitney's current display of the collection shows just how integrated yet distinctive Diamond's painting is within the context of 20th century American art. Synthesizing ideas we find in everything from Franz Klein to Norman Lewis to Hedda Stern into a coherent sensibility, joining the dots between gestural abstraction, urban reality, and mythic tradition, seemingly effortlessly. There's still a lot of work to be done in adequately situating Diamond's work within wider contexts, especially in terms of abstract painting. But it would be absurd to leave out her achievement within American landscape and urban landscape painting, the category in which she stands tall and practically alone. The first real breakthroughs in American city painting had been made by Georgia O'Keeffe in the late 1920s. A time when she lived high up at the top of what was then the Shelton Hotel. Pictures like the Shelton Hotel New York No. 1 were the first truly successful paintings of large Manhattan buildings as individual monolithic forms, rather than, say, the impenetrable wall of details we find in Charles Shearer's precisionist skyscrapers of 1922. O'Keeffe was well aware that she was making progress in what had been a pretty unsuccessful area for painters. "My New Yorks could turn the world over," she said, with typical modesty. The best picture in the series, The Shelton with Sunspots NY, gives itself over almost entirely to optics and atmospherics. The dazzle of the low winter sun, as she put it, taking a bite out of the tower. It's the beginning of a sense of the modern city, not as a visual phenomenon preoccupied with density and size, but as a playground for experiencing constantly shifting conditions of light and atmosphere, shifting states of being. As she said herself, you had to paint New York not as it is, but as it's felt. A very Diamond statement. There are some great paintings in the relatively small but important series, particularly the panoramic views of the East River. Though the more obviously Art Deco pictures occasionally stray into Batman the Animated Series territory, looking a little more dated than perhaps they deserve to. But their sense of scale, their language of tiny sunspots and specks of light against vast expanses, would also inform much more open, malleable works, like 1927's Black Abstraction, a patently enigmatic picture that can read as light in a tunnel, a car rounding a cliff, a reclining figure, a voice from the telephone, smoke from a gun. Its location anywhere from the desert to the subway to the seabed. It's in pictures like this that we really see the origins of paintings like the majestic Grisaille Cityscape No. 2 from 2007. Evocative of Pat Steer's waterfall abstracts, the central shaft kicking up mist as it hits the dark rooftop shape at the base. It's a painting at once fluid and architectonic, visually coherent and spatially paradoxical. To call it a cityscape almost seems intentionally disingenuous. In a similar vein, O'Keeffe also ensured that her city paintings were shown alongside things like landscapes and flowers, making the interplay between natural and urban forms and environments explicit, whilst simultaneously challenging the highly gendered reading of her work with a subject which was at the time deemed inherently masculine. She'd also reverse Diamond's career trajectory by leaving New York behind in favour of the vernacular architecture of New Mexico. Perhaps in a similar attempt to cast off the temporal anchors of the city for something more timeless, mythic, or archetypal. Visionary is an overused and underexamined term, but it's come to be a handy label for the more mystical leanings of O'Keeffe's abstraction, a more mystical and more abstract version of which we find in the paintings of Arthur Dove. O'Keeffe's opposite number in Alfred Stieglitz's stable of American modernists, Dove leaned much more toward landscapes and natural forms throughout his career, though we also find translations of distinctly urban experience in pictures such as the celebrated Foghorns. Like O'Keeffe's Black Abstraction, an almost synesthetic evocation of an indeterminate location on the urban periphery. Dove is a drier, less lush painter than Diamond. Rather than any straightforward formal similarities, it's the radiant intensity of experience indicated by their paintings which connects them. Experience, Dove noted, which should necessitate no effort to understand, bypassing anything cerebral for potent visual shots of things we immediately feel, like weather, light, sound. But we do occasionally find indications of primitive dwellings in Dove's painting. Barns and mills which share Diamond's sense of animism, often with peculiar windows like eyes in cartoonish ghost faces that unavoidably look back to the highly eccentric work of Charles Burchfield. An artist loopier and less muscular than Diamond, but an important forebearer in his attempts to visualise sensation over and above appearances. Burchfield is a kind of visual equivalent to the foundational voices of American poetry, his work evoking everything from Walt Whitman's I Sing the Body Electric to Emily Dickinson's Nature is a Haunted House. With his wailing banshee cabins, his trees radiating energy like electrical pylons, Burchfield operates in the weirdly anthropomorphic, animate mode of the landscape tradition, something which Diamond would extend to the American city. And while much of his work is characterised by a kind of ecstatic over-detailing, he could also be a much sparer artist, at times sailing closer to the mood of his friend and contemporary, Edward Hopper. Each of them, in their own way, exploring the sense of vacancy and expectation that came to define depictions of the built environment in the 20th century. The blank windows and looming shadows that would become cliches by the time they got to Diamond, but which she manages to rescue by sheer force of scale and gesture. Her shadows have as much to do with kaiju movies as Hopper's Evening Sun. We might understand them literally as shadows cast by neighbouring buildings, but they add a huge psychological dimension to the pictures. Feelings of presence and unease, this sense of unseen forces as the light sundials itself across the city. For all their sweeping strength, there's also a sense of crumbling, toppling ruination to the paintings, which calls all the way back to Dove. A sense of death and rot, part and parcel with his wriggling sense of life. A slightly morbid quality, which in turn recalls the balance of hypervitality and decay in Burchfield's haunted universe. After all, kaiju movies are essentially about the fatal collision of modern infrastructure and prehistoric forces. Perhaps the impulse that led filmmakers to fill cardboard cities with rampaging monsters isn't that far from home in the spectacle and scale of Diamond's painting. Except this time, it's the buildings that are the monsters. Or perhaps it's the artist herself, stomping around and causing mayhem. It's also worth remembering that cities like New York exist as much in the imagination as in reality. There's a kind of grand B-movie effect to the paintings, which balances out their more majestic, transcendent qualities. But also an acrobatic, elastic bounce to them that, as John Yao pointed out in a recent review, brings to mind the opening lines of Frank O'Hara's 1961 poem, Steps. How funny you are today, New York, like Ginger Rogers in Swing Time. On a smaller, more personal scale, there's also the sense of mystery and threat of noir, or the horror-tinged films produced by Val Lewton. Films like Cat People, or The Seventh Victim, a favourite of John Ashbery, an acquaintance from the Paris and St. Mark's Poetry Club days. Ashbery called The Seventh Victim one of the great New York noir movies, writing that its artificial sets captured the weird poetry of the city in a way few films ever have. He goes on to quote Giorgio de Chirico from his 1929 novel Hebdomeros. A cardboard setting is always more real than a natural setting, but try telling that to your film directors. As with de Chirico's most celebrated paintings, The Seventh Victim is a study in urban anxiety, dread, something often mixed into Diamond's sense of energy and exhilaration. Particularly in a picture like High Sea, its central black form like a silhouette against a shower curtain, a figure in a doorway. The title itself, a silent scream. Importantly though, Diamond never gets trapped in darkness and oppression. The flip side of the deep time baked into her forms is the immediacy of her light. Momentary and shifting. It's entirely evocative, entirely right, without ever getting finicky. Arriving at an appropriately painterly transposition of reality without descending into slavish mimicry. The colours, as Alex Katz put it, generating an immediate overall light rather than recreating the specific areas of illumination and shadow in a given environment. Instead, we get something that speaks of the active relationship between light and form, the one bending, breaking, and transforming the other, rippling and ricocheting back and forth. Some works are of course made in series, unavoidably leading back to Monet's pictures of Rouen Cathedral. The building evaporating under the failing Normandy sunlight. Not that Diamond's anything so simple as a later-day impressionist. Her work displays a huge range of approach, the attitude of her light varying dramatically from painting to painting. In fact, Deep Time's emphasis on her painterly variousness is one of the things that distinguishes it from some of the more slick, cohesive hangs of recent years. Within just one corner of the show, we move from the apparent Crayola straightforwardness of cityscape with blue shadow, to the halogen nightmare of night, to the aerial silk dance of world trade. A picture which evokes the kind of high-altitude light that can make huge structures seem diaphanous, barely there. With its two tan-coloured columns and chewed-up horizontals, it's as if someone hit the pause button on an old video recording. Something that's only become more poignant in the years since it was painted. World trade is an elegant, gymnastic dream, while the sludgy night scene here on the left is an insomniac's bus ride of confusion. A heap of starkly lit shapes it's impossible to make sense of. The Twilight City, an unmade bed, an Ice Age tar pit. Equally, things can suddenly turn blunt. Cityscape with blue shadow is weirdly ragged, inelegant, dry. Yet, the next moment it's luminous, shimmering, true. Somehow able to stand up, as few such painterly paintings can, to direct comparison with the real world, remixing the city's colours and textures while remaining weirdly contiguous with it, which doesn't stop it simultaneously looking like a 4-colour comic book with a printing error. The blue shadow, a smudge of misaligned ink. It's also worth remembering there's a poppy side to Diamond. She kept scrapbooks with irreverent collisions of high and low art and was an early admirer of Warhol. At the same time, she was absorbing Franz Klein. Empire premiered in 1965, the year she returned to New York. Though she probably knew the film more by reputation, the very idea of it would have surely struck a chord. Time measured in light, changing around a building. The familiar structure losing itself in the dark, like the last days of some ancient civilization. The night sky like Shelley's lone and level sands. The film plays like a deadpan commentary on her entire project, though not without its own sense of poetry. A romanticism even, almost despite itself. Something we also find tucked into the paintings, which she maintained had more to do with perception than emotion. Paintings of immense and evocative subtlety, made, as she put it, with extremely big brushes and extremely big marks. "My paint is very specific to its subject," she wrote. My marks are clear, but my message is ambiguous. I use abbreviation and elision to avoid long-windedness and respect grace. It's difficult to capture in simple descriptive terms the soaring and tumbling nature of Diamond's light and form. The complex interweaving of sensation, weather, atmosphere, psychology, association. For that, perhaps, we have to look to a poet whose goal was also to write beyond the exegetic capabilities of the critic, to outrun language itself. To partially explain the condition of Diamond's best pictures, we could always try John Ashbery's 1974 poem, City Afternoon. If one could seize America, or at least a fine forgetfulness that seeps into our outline, defining our volumes with a stain that is fleeting too, but commemorates because it does define, after all, grey garlands, that threesome waiting for the light to change. Air lifting the hair of one, upside down in the reflecting pool.